This is the world premiere segment of the 2023 What Good Looks Like videos. Started, when did we start these guys? 6 years? 7?
This is Series 6, I think.
Series 6. Yeah. We have 40 of these videos in the library, and we're adding 7 more this year, which will be up in probably a week or so. But those of you in the audience get the world premiere here of as many as we can get in 87 minutes and 38 seconds. The first one is an actual recreation of an event that almost killed hundreds of people. Neil's going to give us some of the real details in a minute. I think this is the first time I've ever said publicly a specific video that I think would possibly save the life of somebody in this room. So it. No, it wasn't overloaded. So you're going to see some a remarkable video, and then Neil has a lot more details, and we'll talk about it. So let's watch the first one.
What you're going to see David do is a recreation of what happened in an Airbus A320. Almost perfect recreation, full of people. So it literally almost cost 150 people their lives.
Okay, let's take a look.
Oh.
Using the correct altimeter setting is more than just a good SOP, it can be life-saving. Let's take a look at a real scenario.
39 Zulu, wind 080, at 10, visibility unrestricted, ceiling 2,700, overcast, temperature 20, viewpoint 15, altimeter 3003, landing and departing, runway 10, advise you have Charlie.
November 396 Delta Mike, San Juan approach, descend and maintain 2,300, altimeter setting 3033. Expect vectors RNAV runway 10. Note, heavy rain showers to the west should not be a factor.
And 396 Delta Mike, we're descending to 2,300, got the new altimeter 3033, and the RNAV radar vectors RNAV 10. All right, descent approach checklist. Descent checklist complete. Approach checklist. Landing data set. Okay, glide path's coming in. 2,300. Speed is good. Approach checklist is complete. On tower 3205. Glide path is captured. We got 3 green landing flaps, landing lights on. Minimums are set. Just approach altitude is 3,000. Okay, minimums are 410, coming out of 1,000 feet. Speed looks good, we're on glide path. Visibility is really bad. He said showers, but he said great weather, but sure not what they said it was. Okay, we're on speed, on glide path.
500.
500. And we are stable. Minimums. Airport's not in sight.
Too low. Terrain.
Terrain. Oh, good grief. 396 Delta Mike. 396 Delta Mike, we're going around. Wow, what the heck happened? Jeez. Okay.
This situation is much more than just a possibility. It almost resulted in a tragic loss of nearly 180 people. In May of 2022, an Airbus 320 descended to within 6 feet of the ground while in hard IMC conditions. And the worst part is, the crew never knew what happened until the airplane was on the ground later. The entire time, their altimeter and their vertical deviation indicator was showing a properly flown, centered RNAV approach. Similar to the situation David just recreated, the Airbus was flying an RNAV approach to LNAV VNAV minimums with the vertical guidance provided by barometric VNAV. In contrast to an ILS or an RNAV approach flown to LPV minimums, on an LNAV VNAV approach with barometric VNAV, the vertical guidance on the final segment is coming entirely from the aircraft's altimeter. Any mistake in the displayed altitude will correlate to a mistake in the displayed vertical deviation. So in both the simulated situation David just flew and the actual situation the Airbus in France flew, even with a centered glide path indication, the aircraft was a consistent 300 feet too low for the entire final approach segment. So how did this happen? It's all because of an erroneous altimeter setting. The actual altimeter as received on the ATIS was 3003, but the approach controller incorrectly read David the altimeter of 3033, and he read it back without catching the large difference between the last altimeter setting he received. By setting the altimeter setting 0.3 of an inch too high, the aircraft flew the entire approach 300 feet lower than desired. This is exactly the situation that happened with the Airbus. An actual altimeter setting of 1001 hectopascals was read by the controller as 1011 hectopascals, roughly the same difference that David experienced in his video. What's even more frightening about this threat is you may have noticed the aircraft's Terrain Awareness and Warning System, or TAWS, did not provide any warnings to David until he'd already initiated the go-around and was within about 50 feet of the ground at that point. This is by design. The TAWS system ramps down sensitivity as the aircraft approaches the runway so that we don't get nuisance alerts very close to the airport. A consequence of this is you may not receive a TAWS warning at a dangerously low altitude in the last mile to mile and a half approaching the threshold. Flight Safety recreated this scenario for us in several citation simulators, and in every case, a TAWS warning did not occur until the aircraft was within 30 to 60 feet of the ground. In response to the Airbus event of 2022, we at the CJP Safety and Education Foundation made some changes to the CJP SOPs, or Standard Operating Practices. When flying an approach with Baro VNAV guidance on final, the pilot should obtain and cross-check a minimum of 2 independent altimeter settings. Possible sources include the ATIS, AWOS, or ASOS, the altimeter setting as received from ATC, and a METAR received via SiriusXM, ADS-BN, or data link if the aircraft is equipped. You may have caught that the ATIS correctly reported the altimeter setting of 3003, while the approach controller incorrectly and David read back an altimeter setting of 3033. If flying an aircraft equipped with a radar altimeter, the pilot should check the radar altitude when approaching minimums against the charted height above touchdown zone at minimums. Understanding that variations in terrain and buildings can cause a slight difference in displayed RA, we're looking for gross differences from the expected height above the ground. Further, if the aircraft has the ability to set 2 different minimum alerts, for example on a ProLine 21, consider setting one alert to radar altitude above TDZ and the other to the approach baromins. If the minimum calls don't happen more or less at the same time, something is amiss. So let's look at the when, where, and why of a Baro VNAV guided final approach. So first, why was David flying an approach with barometric VNAV guidance? Because of where he was. Flying the approach to San Juan, the aircraft is just outside the footprint of WAS coverage. To this point, a note on the approach plate says that WAS VNAV is not authorized on this approach. Vertical guidance must come from barometric VNAV. How do we know we are being provided guidance vertically from barometric VNAV on final? For a Garmin-powered flight deck, G1000NXI or G3000, the indication is right on the VDI. If we see a V at the top of the VDI and this home plate or 5-sided pentagon figure, we know that our guidance is coming from barometric VNAV, in contrast to a diamond with a G, which tells us that the guidance is coming from WAS. Let's see how this would look in a different avionics platform and see how we could use that information the radar altimeter provides.
.396 Delta Mike, descend and maintain 2,300. Expect vectors RNAV runway 10. Current altimeter setting is 3033.
All right, 2,300 and 3033 Delta Mike. So this is our first chance to prevent the situation that David experienced from occurring. Hearing a new altimeter of 3033 and knowing that I am going to be flying a Barrow VNAV approach, our SOPs say we need to compare that with a second altimeter. So my options are XM weather, first of all. Unfortunately, since we are out of the lower 48, if I try to pull up a METAR for San Juan, that's not going to be an option. So in the absence of having a current METAR from XM or data link to the airplane be equipped, my only other option is from the ATIS. I've already received the ATIS and I heard the ATIS say the altimeter was 3033. This is our first and best chance to prevent this problem from occurring. I'm going to query the controller and I'm going to ask him to confirm the altimeter setting, and if he reads 3033 again, I'm going to again say, okay, the ATIS is reporting 3003, just want to make one more confirmation. Really don't want to just accept that such a huge difference in altimeter setting could have occurred in the 45 minutes since the ATIS came out. If we're in level flight and I misset the altimeter as David did, it's very obvious that setting it to 3033 makes the indicated altitude jump up by 300 feet. But as David experienced this in the descent, it was less obvious what had happened. But let's imagine that I don't catch this mistake. I'm going to bring the aircraft down to an indicated altitude of 2,300 feet, which will of course be actually 2,000 feet MSL. I'll set the co-pilot side to 3033 as well so we don't get that miscompare. And then let's look at how the glide path is going to present itself. Now with the incorrect altimeter setting and the source of our VDI being barometric VNAV, when our VDI centers, and if we've armed the approach mode, when our glide path engages and actually tracks that VDI, we're going to be consistently 300 feet below the desired glide path. So here we are approaching the final approach fix. We're going to imagine that we did not catch the incorrect altimeter and have misset it to 3033 as occurred with David. But let's look at further SOPs that could help us prevent this situation from becoming unsafe. First, we have set our co-pilot's minimums to radar altitude of 398, which corresponds to the expected height above the ground at our DA. We have set altitude the pilot's minimums to the Barrow 410 as our standard procedure. We would expect to then have these minimums calls occur at roughly the same time. Next, as we approach our final approach fix of REMSI, we see that we should be crossing on our glide path at 1,500 feet, knowing that we're flying in a coastal area where the ground is approximately sea level. We would also expect to see our radar altitude indicate 1,500 feet across REMSI. Understanding, of course, that variations in terrain under the aircraft won't make it indicate exactly 1,500, but if we notice a large discrepancy, that's cause for investigating further. So we're now coupled and flying a parallel flight path 300 feet too low because of our misset altimeter. Again, to us in the cockpit though, it looks like we are right on our glide path where we want to be. So, unlike in the Garmin flight decks where the VDI looks different on the PFD, the only way to know the source of our glide path information on a Collins equipped aircraft is to go into the index, arrival data page, where we will see that barometric VNAV is the source of our glide path. Contrast how this screen looks when we're flying an approach into an area such as Stuart, Florida that is in the WAS footprint. We see that our approach VNAV guide path information is coming from WAS, and we would be using LPV minimums. Approaching Ramsey, we'll make our first check of our radar altimeter as we cross the fix. Coming directly across Ramsey, we see our indicated altitude is 1,500 feet. Again, our indicated altitude is the problem, so it's not going to show us that something's wrong. But our radar altitude shows us 300 feet below that desired altitude. Again, giving us our first sign, if we misset the altimeter, that something is not right here. Our next check is going to be approaching minimums. As we approach our baro mins of 410, we would expect to see our radar altitude approaching 400 feet AGL. We have our simulator visuals set to good VFR conditions so that you could see what the flight path David was flying looked like. Of course, David was in hard IMC, as was the Airbus, so he wasn't aware of how close to the ground and how far from the runway he was until he broke out near minimums. Now, we're not expecting to hear a minimums call until 410 indicated altitude.
Minimums.
So the fact that we're hearing our minimums call well above what we expect to see for baro mins tells us that our radar altitude is much lower than we expect. That was our second potential catch by having the co-pilot's minimum set to radar. Our final check is as we approach our indicated minimums, we expect to see 400 feet on the radar altitude, but here we are not even at minimums and we're well below 200. This is our last check, and of course if we were visual, we can clearly see looking out the window that we're not in a good spot. Now you'll notice we're below 100 feet and we have yet to get a TAWS warning. In fact, we don't get a TAWS warning until approximately 30 feet radar altitude. If we weren't anticipating this situation, that would not be enough time for most pilots to react, perform a go-around without hitting the ground. So the TAWS is not going to be a viable line of defense in this type of situation.
That's good. Yeah.
Let's wait. Yeah. Yep.
Any more comments on that one, Neil?
Well, I mean, I think this would be a great time to open up to questions. So again, the Airbus had exactly the same situation. It was an example of a sequence of undesirable events contributing to this. The approach lights for the runway they were shooting the approach to were not turned on because officially the weather was very good, just as we recreated. The official METAR was excellent. Unbeknownst to the controllers, there was a pretty intense rain shower to the east of the airport in Paris. That was what the Airbus was flying through. So they experienced really low IMC all the way down. And in fact, they never broke out. We raised the sim ceiling a little bit just so that you could get that really visceral feeling at the end of David.
They got
so
to
low.
within 6 feet of the ground, right?
6 feet, and they were not over the airport at 6 feet. They were over a road and a field at 6 feet, so outside the airport fence, and they never knew. They actually flew the approach again with the same misset altimeter. The second time, they also descended 300 feet too low, but the rain shower had passed through, so they broke out above minimums, looked up and said, something's not right here. You know, we're really low for where we should be, leveled off, landed safely. But they never figured it out until later, until the accident or incident reconstruction occurred. They never figured out what happened. The crew was completely oblivious the first time through that they got that close to the ground.
The big deal here is you got a single point failure with this kind of an approach if you miss that altimeter setting, which is why we tried to put into our SOPs, what are the backups that you could use to keep it from being that single point failure? We had an old saying in the military, altimeter low, look out below, and that's what you had was a setting that should have been lower than what you had in there. So this is a big deal, and it could bite any of us. Worth your time reviewing this a few times and look at your own avionics and see what you can do among the choices that Neil picked there. Not the Mustangs most of them don't have radar altimeter, but there are other things that you can do, like you pointed out in the video, to help give yourself a really good backup.
Hey, David, I don't know if I'm just making it up, but
I felt when I was taking a look on the SynViz at the flight path marker that it was showing you were going to arrive short of the runway. So is that another check? I would have expected the flight path marker, the meatball, to be on the end of the runway.
Yeah,
Yep.
that's a good point. There's probably no one in this room that has not forgotten or had an altimeter in their career screw up, right?
Yep.
I would suggest that one time when you might be very vigilant about that is an unusual situation or an emergency situation. Patty and I were coming back from the Turks and Caicos over Florida about a year and a half ago, and I was at 41, just in the wispy tops of the precip below, significant precip below, and I had a T2 icing failure in the Mustang, and both engines rolled back, which I had experienced before, so that wasn't an emergency, but followed by the MFD blanking out entirely, and then followed by a left windshield heat fail. So I had 3 situations going on, and I decided at the time that we needed to stop flying in icing conditions, and we needed to get on the ground. So it wasn't an emergency, but I diverted to an unplanned alternate, descending at 3,000 feet a minute with the speed brake out to avoid some significant weather that I didn't intend to go in, followed by an approach to an alternate that I hadn't planned for that had a runway shut down, and I was cleared for a circle in 800 feet, ceilings. Didn't like that, so I was asking for a third alternate, and then I got a low altitude alert because during all that descent at high speed and high rate, I forgot to reset the altimeter out of 18. So when you might, I don't know how you can plan for that, but in the back of your mind, you might tell your companion, watch that altimeter setting, because if you're ever in a situation where your blank is your alligator's up to your, that saying, you might just forget to do that. So.
But I like, we ought to take note of Mark's comment. Again, in thoroughness, you're all going to have different avionics, and if you have SynViz, that's another good clue, right? Your flight path marker's not where it ought to be. We can throw that into the list.
Absolutely. And one thing I think you could take away from this video too is I would hazard how many of you have ever in the sim or in the airplane during training had the instructor give you a WAS failure? Not one hand up. I do this one hand in the back. Rusty, you don't count. I do this every single recurrent. So anytime I fly with someone in the airplane, in all of our flight decks, you can deselect SBAS, which is the generic term for WAS, is one flavor of SBAS that we have in the US. So you can deselect this, and I'll start talking to the pilot about his kids and what's going on, and hey, what are the minimums again? Can you look it up? And while he's looking, I'll turn off WAS. And so he's loaded the approach, he flies the whole approach, WAS has failed, and depending on your avionics platform, you're gonna have different notifications from the flight deck, different indications from the flight deck, some steps you may or may not have to take. But it's amazing how often pilots don't catch this. And it's on my first-time jet owners talk a couple days ago, I talk about things with a steep learning curve, which means after you've done them once or twice, you're a lot better than you were the first time you did it. And this is something with a steep learning curve. If you just go do this once or twice with an instructor in a sim or in the airplane for practice, you're going to feel a lot more confident than understanding what's happening, what the presentations look like.
Hey, Neil, would you get a RAIM alert when the WAS is out?
No, you won't. So RAIM's a totally different function. RAIM is a function of how many satellites are visible and then over-computing of the position.
No, I agree. I understand their difference. I was just wondering if maybe, I was wondering if maybe they were going to use that one alert to also, tell you, but
no. What you will get, and this is going to depend, this is going to vary a lot on the avionics platforms. And off the top of my head, I fly most of the major models that our members are flying. Off the top of my head, I think the M2 and 3 Plus have the best implementation of this, where you will actually get a CAS message that you have to lower your minimums. On the NXI, I don't believe you get a CAS message, and on the ProLine, you don't get a message.
Yeah, I was thinking there was one of the messages with 4.8, not with 3.2.
Yes, it's a fairly new addition. And of course, then the major thing that you'll see on any platform, and this is what I'm specifically training pilots to look for, because a lot of pilots don't look for this, is when you're flying an approach and everything's copacetic, you're going to see, depending on your platform, on the Garmin's, it's going to be in magenta. On the ProLines, it's not, and it's a little bit off to the side. But you should see the integrity level you're flying to enunciated in the center of the HSI on any of the Garmin flight decks, and off to the side, you'll see LPV approach on the ProLine. Depending on the flight deck, there is a way for it to tell you this isn't good. It might show it in yellow in the case of the Garmin's. It might have a different enunciation than you expect to see, so you might see LNAV, VNAV when you expect to see LPV, but something's not going to be right. And in some of our flight decks, it's very subtle, and this is why I say it's something on the steep learning curve. The first time you do it, you're going to say, wow, that would be really easy to miss, but then hopefully you've trained yourself to look for it down the road.
Yeah, I'm pretty confident I would have seen the flight path marker because I saw it even here. I'm 100% confident I would not pick up the difference on the LPV, LNAV, V.
Yeah.
100% confident.
Too small a print, right?
And you know, on the flight path marker, Mark, that's a great point, but I would tell you to dial down your confidence that you would have seen the flight path marker, because the number of things that pilots can omit from their scan when they're task saturated is pretty impressive. I think Charlie would agree from the military environment that when you get task saturated, you can have a blaring horn in your ear, and there are crews who have literally said later they did not hear a warning horn because they were really loaded up. So that's why we're trying to create layers of defense on this so that we're not dependent on any one scan or item to save us.
So a year ago, we came up with the idea to sell a cameo appearance in our video. What a stupid idea. Everybody's at the auction drinking wine, and somebody raises their hand and says, $10,000. And we go, oh my God, what are we going to deal with here? We got lucky because we got a guy named Arnie Evdokimo who won it last year and actually won it last night. He had such a good time. Tell us a little bit about your experience.
I loved it. I had so much fun with these gentlemen. I learned so much. It was really a lot of fun thinking about what to do, what we can do to make a difference in other people's lives, or maybe do something important. So I really had a great time.
And we got lucky. Arnie's your flight, you CJ4 and thousands of hours. Yeah. So, you know, we were crossing our fingers, but Arnie was flawless in his video. Let's take a look and see how his acting.
And on all of these, when David plays I'm going to show you what good doesn't look like, it's actually kind of tough to fly it, intentionally wrong, right?
As a matter of fact, a true story, it happens almost every year because we have to shoot typically 3 or 4 times at different camera angles, and Neil will do it correctly, and we shoot out of sequence, and the more Neil has to remind me often, you're not screwing up enough, because I'm watching Neil do it right, and I'm not anyway.
I told Patty that. She didn't believe me.
Yeah, right. Sometimes confusing. Anyway, let's watch Arnie's claim to fame here.
So it's clear in a million, but it's certainly not time to let your guard down on proper pattern procedures. Maybe this next scenario has happened to you. Let's take a look.
November 163, Mike, descend and maintain 2000. Enter a right downwind for runway 5. Report to airport in sight.
Okay, down to 2,000 and enter right downwind for runway 5, 163 Mike. And report to airport in sight. Go. Still can see the airport.
November 163, Mike, state your airspeed.
160 Mike is 225. Ah, crap.
163, Mike, roger.
Yeah, that's not going to be good. There we go, hold on, 200.
No one wants to get a message to call ATC or be alerted that there's someone from the FAA waiting to talk to them after they shut their aircraft down. Let's look at proper pattern procedures. Violating speed restrictions is a common reason for pilot deviations in turbine aircraft. FAR 91-117 says very clearly a pilot cannot operate above 200 knots indicated airspeed when at or below 2,500 feet AGL within 4 nautical miles of the primary airport of a Class C or D airspace area. So approaching Naples, Arnie needed to have slowed to 200 before he descended below 2,500 feet. Remember that we're all now flying with ADS-B out, which transmits indicated airspeed, not just ground speed. So ATC knows exactly what your indicated airspeed is at all times if they want to. Besides airspeed violations, incorrect pattern entries are responsible for many pilot deviations. Let's look at another situation you could find yourself in.
Okay, where's that airport? Can't wait to get there. Hang with my friends. And why do they call this place Bar Harbor? Huh. Oh well. Bar Harbor traffic citation 163 Mike, 2,000 feet, about 8 south of the airport. Will be right down when runway 22, full stop. All right. Get the gear down, start a right base. Power coming back. Full flaps coming. And here we go. All right, well, that was one of my better landings. Easy to do in this plane, I hope. And I hope the FBO's got my rental car, and I hope they got the hangar space, because I didn't get confirmation of that. And Modern Aviation, this is 163 Mike. We're supposed to have a rental car there and some hangar space today. We'll be here 3 days. Is everything ready to go?
November 163 Mike, roger. Taxi to parking ahead of our hangar. As you egress the aircraft, it's FAA person would like to meet you at your airplane.
Oh, wow. All right, when I get out of the aircraft, I'll talk to the FAA guy. Thank you, 163 Mike. I wonder what he wants. It was pretty much a perfect flight. I liked it. Nice weather. Huh, I have to think about that one.
The FARs are very clear. When approaching an airport without an operating control tower, the pilot is required to make all turns to the left in the traffic pattern unless right traffic is clearly indicated for that airport. The best way to know if right traffic is indicated is in the chart supplement. Here's an example for nearby Brunswick Executive Airport, which indicates right traffic for runway 1 left and right. But again, if there is no indication of right traffic, left traffic is required. A pilot approaching Bar Harbor from the southwest when the landing runway is 22 would have a natural tendency to just join the right downwind. But this is, again, not allowed by the FAR and is a very common violation when the airport is busy during the summer. So let's look at how Arnie should have entered the left pattern for runway 22. Once the runway in use and proper traffic pattern direction have been determined, the pilot should proceed to a point well clear of the pattern before descending and entering the pattern at pattern altitude. A pilot should never descend to pattern altitude in the traffic pattern. This is to allow for sufficient time to view the entire traffic pattern before entering the pattern. The FAA recommends one of 2 entries be used. The preferred entry is to cross over the midfield and join the downwind at a 45-degree angle, giving you good visibility of traffic on downwind. The alternate of a midfield entry is permitted only when the pattern is not congested. And finally, don't forget that turbine aircraft are required to maintain no lower than 1,500 feet above the airport until necessary to descend for landing. We're going to fly a proper pattern entry this time. I'm maintaining an altitude 500 feet above the traffic pattern, and I'm flying across the airport at midfield. This keeps me well above any airplanes in the traffic pattern and giving me good visibility to see what's happening on the downwind. I'm going to fly out past the traffic pattern area, descend to pattern altitude so that I'm down at pattern altitude before I join that left downwind. So we've just overflown the airport at an altitude 500 feet above the traffic pattern altitude. This keeps us well clear of any traffic in the pattern while also giving us a good visual picture of the downwind. And we're now flying away from the airport. We're not going to descend down to our traffic pattern altitude until we are well outside the pattern. By the time we enter the downwind, we should be level at the pattern altitude, and we want to join at about a 45. So at this point, I can see I'm about 2 to 3 miles away from the airport. It's directly behind us. We're flying away. So this is a good time where I can make my descent down to pattern, and I can make my turn around So here we are at the proper turbine pattern altitude. We're entering the downwind at a 45 degree. I have a great visual picture of who's in the pattern. So as I turn onto my downwind, there should be no surprises. Remembering at an airport without an operating control tower, there often are aircraft without radios in the pattern. So relying on the Unicom or CTAF frequency to understand the picture is not always sufficient.
Yay, thanks, Arnie.
Thank you, Arnie. I think we have to comment. What airplane do you fly, Arnie?
Before?
And what do you have to shoot in the sim of?
Some plane I've never seen before.
So Arnie showed up, and we don't do videos in the 4. It was Mustang Day. So Barney said, "What are we flying?" I said, "Get in the Mustang." He said, "What?" So he did an amazing job, having flown a Mustang. That's how easy the Mustang is to fly. There you go. That's right.
That's true.
That was fantastic. Next one, this guy here, Indra, has done an amazing job revitalizing our legacy efforts with the committee and all the things that you're doing. And a couple of years ago, the safety committee said, we need to be doing videos in legacy airplanes. So we started 2 years ago, and we've done that 2 years now. We've done videos. We fly to San Antonio, and they have a Citation 2, which I guess is moving to Houston or Atlanta or something. So we'll be moving around doing those. But this next one is his video in something about that little button it's on the yoke. I don't know what it's called, but I never push it. But it's a
TCS, CV. I mean, it has many names.
It makes the bar. I don't know what it's called, but let's watch the video.
Well, before we do that, it's been fun to be with David in an airplane that has round gauges and stuff.
Oh my God!
Because he doesn't have to work that hard to screw up. It actually, it actually happens pretty naturally.
So I flew a Sabreliner for many years, which was 1960s vintage, but I've forgotten how hard it is to fly a true legacy airplane with no vertical navigation and all these things. So I actually flew with him in his 5 from San Antonio to Dallas, and my mouth was open about half the time. Just how is he going to make that altitude crossing restriction? There's no way. But he does an amazing job. But they are definitely higher workload airplanes, and we have seen a higher accident rate in those older airplanes. So it's really cool that the avionics manufacturers are coming out with better ways to integrate those systems. But
yeah, and the other thing that's happening is flight safety and loft, and everybody is now finally starting to take out the old avionics and put GTN 750s in it. I know flight safety is doing it. Loft is doing it. So that's good improvement because we did that survey, if you remember, a while back, and 67% of the legacy aircraft, sort of loosely defined, have done some kind of Garmin GTN upgrade. So the fleet is actually upgraded, but the simulators are not, and that's now happening, which is great news for us.
Cool. Let's watch it.
So that button on the yoke you hardly ever use, it's called CWS, or control wheel steering, and in some of our airplanes it's called the sync button. It can come in really handy sometimes. Let's take a look.
Okay, takeoff checklist is complete. Stand by for clearance. 396 Delta Mike is ready, 1-3 right.
Citation 396 Delta Mike. Fly runway heading, fly maintain 5,000. You're clear for takeoff, runway 13 right.
Runway heading 5,000, 1-3 right, clear for takeoff, 396 Delta Mike. Brakes released. Power set. Airspeed's aligned. V1, rotate. Positive rate. E2 plus 10. Flaps coming up.
396 Delta Mike, contact San Antonio departure 128.05.
12805, 396 Delta Mike. And departure 396 Delta Mike, with you at a 1.5, climbing 5,000, runway heading.
396 Delta Mike, roger. I maintain a 3,000 for traffic, sir. And traffic's going to be crossing left to right.
Okay, 3,000 for 396 Delta Mike. You're looking for that traffic.
396 Delta Mike, traffic's now at your 10 o'clock and 5 miles.
Okay, we're looking for the traffic's 396 Delta Mike. And say again the altitude for 6 Delta Mike?
6 Delta Mike, maintain 3,000 feet for traffic, sir.
6 Delta Mike, 3,000 feet. It's 3,000 feet, slowing down, we're too fast. 3,000, altitude down.
396 Delta Mike, say altitude.
6 Delta Mike, descending to 3,000.
6 Delta Mike, we're showing 3,400 feet. I've got a phone number for you, sir.
6 Delta Mike, stand by. Dang it. Well, we're back in Flight Safety Citation 2 Simulator with Indra Holan, Chairman of the Legacy Committee for the CJP. Welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Glad to have you again.
Yeah, thank you.
Let's talk a little bit about this silly button on the yoke, this TCS button, also called the control wheel steering button. I know in situations where I have been unsure what the airplane was doing, I tend to just disconnect the autopilot rather than use this button, which causes then some out of trim, out of pitch control, and it's a very kind of unstable situation. Let's talk about why we should be using this button. What's your experience?
Well, my experience, first of all, is that it took me a while to figure out what that button did.
We don't get much training in that, do we?
We don't, and it's kind of a mystery because it does a couple things. One is when you're hand flying the aircraft, and you have your flight director in some vertical mode, and you pitch up above it or below it, and that's where you want to keep the pitch of the aircraft. If you hit that button, you sync the flight director to your current pitch. So that's very useful. Let's say you take off and you're set for 7-degree go-around for your takeoff pitch. And let's say you come out and you realize you need about 10 degrees. Well, you just sync it, and now you've got the new flight director pitch. So that's good. The most useful part, though, is when you're flying on autopilot and you want to do a deviation or something relatively short in terms of correction. The TCS button disconnects the autopilot temporarily and let you hand fly, but it doesn't change anything else on the setup of the flight director panel. And when you're done with the deviation, you let go and the autopilot just goes back on and continues where it was. So it's very useful for small deviations.
I think of it in car terms like a clutch.
Right.
It's almost like when you put your foot in on a clutch, and you let out on the clutch, and everything resumes where it was.
Right, and it's very smooth and very natural, both disengaging and engaging. Sometimes when you disengage the autopilot with the big red button, the whole airplane shakes, and like what happened, right?
It makes it worse.
It makes it worse, yeah. I mean, the other time it's very useful is, and particularly in the legacy citations, you have an anomaly in the flight director and autopilot setup, which is you have this altitude select button, which is different than most autopilots and flight directors in bigger airplanes. If you don't arm this when you set an altitude, it will not capture the altitude when you get to it. And it's a very common mistake that new legacy pilot do. And so what happens is you get closer, you level up, you expect it to level up, and all of a sudden you're going through it. And the natural reaction is to grab the yoke and start pulling or pushing.
Like I did in the video.
Like you did. And then you're fighting the autopilot up, down, and it's just a very difficult situation to control. And the better way to do that is when you see that, is just grab that TCS button, push it down, and now you're just leveling off nicely and easily with everything in control, very smooth. And then you hand fly the aircraft. You won't be fighting the trim, you won't be fighting the autopilot. And once you are stable, you just make sure that the flight director is matched to the airplane, and you let go, and now the autopilot is flying it with the modes you already had in the airplane.
Keep it simple.
Keep it simple.
That's great information.
Oh, thank
Thanks,
you.
Andrew. Great to see you again.
Good to see you
Hope
too.
to see you next year.
All right, sounds good.
Thanks. Next time you're in for training, ask your instructor to set up a scenario for you that requires the use of the TCS or the control wheel steering button just to get you some practice. See you later.
Now, we also shot that video in one of the other sims, and if we have time at the end, we'll show it. But in case we don't have time, just to make sure everyone understands what happened to David, because it's not completely clear. When you fight the autopilot, so in David's case, he sees that he's gone through his altitude, and he's trying to push the plane down without disconnecting the autopilot. And this may seem crazy. I see people do it all the time. All the time. Again, when you get task saturated, you panic, your attention narrows, people will do things they would think they would never do. So now imagine the plane is, let's say, climbing at 200, just make it simple, and you start fighting. You start pushing the nose down. The airplane reads that as a force on the elevator. And so what is the autopilot going to do since it's still engaged? It's going to counteract that force with trim. And so now it's saying, oh boy, I need more nose up trim. And that's exactly what David was experiencing. The sim recreates this great, and the other series of videos show this really well. And this is not a hypothetical. This has killed people in an airplane because the pilots start fighting the airplane, and it results in massive positive and negative G oscillations, and it's thrown people around the back of the airplane. It gets so extreme. And all he had to do was use the control wheel steering button. Or he could have disconnected the autopilot, but we're trying to show an alternate technique to a pure
This is actually a pretty common scenario in legacy or experienced airplanes with this kind of Sperry autopilot setup, because it's different than any other autopilot that you have. In normal autopilots, you set the altitude and you do in vertical mode, FLC or vertical speed, and the airplane starts going down and it captures the altitude. Here, you set the altitude, nothing happens. You got to roll the pitch wheel or something, and then you're heading down. And if you don't arm the altitude select, you will blow through the altitude. And I've seen people do it in the cockpit many times when they have been flying other airplanes. And the natural reaction when you get and you're busting the altitude is to just grab it and hold it, right? And now you're into the wild horse race that David was demonstrating, and all kinds of bad stuff can happen.
Cool. Good.
Very good.
In 2016, CJP lost two special people, Don and Dawn Baker, in a fatal CJ accident. They were departing Salt Lake City in IMC conditions and icing conditions, and after a regional event for CJP there, some of you, I think, may have been actually in the room and said goodbye to them when they departed. Don's comment to ATC was, "I lost my altitude." It likely was an ADC or AHRS failure, although the NTSB, in a pretty significant investigation, could find no physical evidence of that happening. But Don was unable to hand fly the airplane, and he and Dawn lost their lives. So these are the kinds of situations and failures that are most critical to us flying our airplane. And we have 3 videos that we're going to look at in all 3 avionics systems of what that situation looks like, starting with Proline 21 on CJ3.
If you're flying more than one avionics platform, you know it can be really challenging, and sometimes that extra button push can be critically important. Let's take a look.
November 396 Delta Mike, maintain flight level 280. You have traffic crossing at 290.
6 Delta Mike, we're looking for the traffic in 280 on the altitude. Oh, great. All right, lost the screen. Well, okay, we're climbing to 28. Here we go, and go back here, look at the standby. We need to get that back. Autopilot. We've got the autopilot on, right?
396 Delta Mike, that traffic is now closing. Main level at flight level 280.
6 Delta Mike. Okay, we've gone through the
Autopilot.
gone through the altitude. Say again the altitude for 6 Delta Mike.
69 Delta Mike, begin immediate descent to flight level 280.
2806 Delta Mike, and we're looking for the traffic. Okay, all right. I'll handle the airplane. 28.
That was uncomfortable to watch and clearly dangerous had traffic really been 1,000 feet above David's assigned altitude. Let's look at some steps we can take to identify and fix potential avionics malfunctions in our different avionics platforms our members fly. Let's look at that same situation David experienced. With the PFD failure, we don't have any memory items, but it would serve us well to be conversant in the procedure. The QRH directs us to select the display reversion, select revert to MFD. The sooner we do that, we can get our primary flight instruments back, we can confirm our autopilot is engaged, and if necessary, re-engage it and reselect modes. Let's look at another potential avionics malfunction. During the climb out, if we're presented on our PFD with a loss of attitude
Autopilot.
and heading information accompanied by attitude, heading in a red box, we know we've lost our AHARS, our attitude heading reference system. The checklist is going to direct us first to select our AHARS reversionary position of our switch. This is now taking information from AHARS 2 and presenting it on PFD 1. Our next problem is to regain use of the flight director. With the flight director coupled to the left side, the system is not able to give us guidance. So the next step in the checklist is using the autopilot transfer button to tell the flight director that we want to couple to the right display and right set of AHARS and attitude and air data information. Now, unfortunately, our autopilot is still not available to us with an AHARS failed, but now we do have use of our flight director again. We can reselect any desired lateral and vertical modes, and we will not have use of the autopilot, but we will at least have use of the flight director. Let's look at how a failure of the air data computer would present. We see on our PFD a loss of our airspeed, altitude, and vertical speed information and associated red boxes. We know we have an ADC failure. The checklist directs us first to select the reversionary position with the DADC switch. This is going to drive the PFD from ADC number 2. Next, similar to an AHARS failure, the checklist tells us to select the autopilot transfer button so that our flight director and autopilot are now getting information from the operational ADC number 2. Unlike an AHARS failure, the autopilot is still usable with a single ADC failure. Again, though, we do need to reselect our lateral and vertical modes following the autopilot transfer. But from here on out, our operation in terms of the avionics will be normal. Of special note is in this particular airplane, the CJP, a loss of ADC1 is going to have associated other system failures, namely with the pressurization system. We would also need to ensure that the transponder is selected to the side with the operational air data computer.
Any comments?
Very good. Yeah, so it might not be intuitively obvious why we have the autopilot with an ADC failure but not with an AHARS. And it's easy to remember if you just consider that attitude, control of the aircraft with pitch and roll is very critical to avoid loss of control. And so it requires redundant systems that have to be equal in comparing with the common information in order to have the autopilot controlling the airplane. Whereas With ADC failure, the single application of one of the systems is sufficient to allow you to regain the use of the autopilot. So it might be a simple way to remember what you're going to have in those two different situations, like Neil pointed out.
Yeah, and I would just add, our impetus to film this set of videos is this is something when I go through Recurrent every year on the 525 series. And sometimes the instructor shows it to you, sometimes they don't. And I think it's of high enough value. It's good that if you go through a cycle where maybe you don't do these, you could ask if you have a few more minutes, but if not, we created the videos so you could have a little refresher from the videos because it's something you haven't seen for a while. The steps may seem a little difficult and foreign.
And the other one to go to the next step would be not just an ADC failure, but to have things like a frozen pitot tube during climb, or you forgot to turn the pitot heat on when you climb through icing. You get a miscompare in your, potentially in your two airspeed indicators, and now you've got to figure out which one is correct. In any of those situations, you want to get the aircraft under control. It's best to level off if you can and sort things out.
And I will mention in a previous series, we did film David in a CJ3 simulator experiencing not an AHARS enunciated failure, but an AHARS roll. So it was actually presenting bad attitude information, which is even worse. If you just have big black area, it's pretty easy to understand, but when it's presenting conflicting information. So that's a great video to go back and review.
Yeah, well worth your time to go into these various scenarios that can fail. We don't really know what the final failure was for Dawn and Dawn, but obviously it was a bad outcome.
Yeah. I just want to say, in the modern airplanes, you have a lot of redundancy backup. You flip a few switches and you can put everything pretty much everywhere, right? In the older airplanes, this kind of situation, if you lose a gyro, is a little more challenging depending on what you have. So, for example, in Citation 1 I flew, I was over the Gulf of Mexico going into Miami, Opa-locka, one night at 43,000, and I got a heading change for traffic. And I do my heading, I'm in autopilot, and all of a sudden my gyro just goes, tumbles, and 45 degrees. And my autopilot kicks off. And now I'm flying from the co-pilot side instruments up there, and everything's like squirrely and stuff. And my peanut is like down here, the little backup attitude indicator. And what I learned from that is that it would be much better to have the backup indicator right up here. So I think we did a video on this, didn't we? A while back? Yeah. So I did the thing you can do very quickly, which I bought a Dynon, I think it's called L3 or something, pocket panel that's battery operated and USB powered, and just stuck it on a Velcro right next to my my flight director, and that's what I flew with. And I even put it in the 5 because the backup is kind of like down in here, and you don't really want to fly from that. Now, as the sophistication of the aircraft increases, you get more backup and more ways to do it. But if you fly an older aircraft, this is a little more challenging sometimes.
These are situations where having a well-trained companion could save your life. Does your companion know exactly where the emergency checklist is? Not that it's in the airplane or in the cockpit, but exactly? Could she put her hand on it at any time? Could she transmit on the radio if you needed to? If you're literally unable to control the airplane and you're trying to sort the situation out, having that second person there could be a very important thing. So it's something to practice. You fly all the time, lots of times with your companion there. Show them where those things are. In that kind of emergency situation, it could be critical.
Yeah. The other thing I thought we were going to talk about, but a lot of these accidents happen on takeoff. And particularly for new jet owners, which in the legacy group we've been focusing on, that's a very challenging time because you come from a turboprop or a single engine Cirrus or something, and all of a sudden everything happens super fast, 6,000 foot per minute, 1,500 foot level off. And Steph, the pro pilot in the family, she wrote an article for, I think it was for us, right? A little while back, which is, here's the transition to your first jet. And one of the things she said was, just because you can fly fast doesn't mean you have to fly fast. And I found that particularly jumping into the Stallion, which was an incredible machine, the first few times I took off, and you got that 1,500 foot level up, it was a zero-G maneuver most of the time. And I pretty quickly learned that 90 to 85% is my friend as soon as you get a little bit of altitude. And And particularly when you have challenging departure and stuff, it's just worth slowing down that airplane, maybe leave the flaps up a little longer and stuff, so that if something like this happened, you have a little more time to do things, you know?
If you haven't flown in a month and you're getting in your airplane and all of a sudden things are happening and you're behind the airplane, slow down. Gives you much more time to think about it. We just kind of full power and we're going to climb up as fast as we can. It's just not necessary in many situations.
It's such a good tip. I'm doing in-aircraft training all the time, and I'll see pilots who are still briefing the approach, still setting up the approach. They're getting vectored onto downwind, and they're flying 200 knots. I said, why don't you put some flaps out and slow to 150? You're going to give yourself 25% more time to do all the stuff you're feeling so rushed on right now. So yeah, you don't have to fly fast just because you can.
Let's take a look at a similar scenario in the G3000 system.
If you're flying more than one avionics platform, you know it can be really challenging, and sometimes that extra button push can be critically important. Let's take a look.
November 396 Delta Mike, maintain flight level 280. You have traffic crossing at 290.
6 Delta Mike, we're looking for the traffic in 280 on the altitude. Oh, great. All right, lost the screen. Well, okay, we're climbing to 28. Here we go, and go back here, look at the standby. We need to get that back. Autopilot. We've got the autopilot on, right?
396 Delta Mike, that traffic is now closing. Main level at flight level 280.
6 Delta Mike. Okay, we've gone through the
autopilot.
Gone through the altitude. Let's say again the altitude for 6 Delta Mike.
69 Delta Mike, begin immediate descent to flight level 280.
2806 Delta Mike, and we're looking for the traffic. Okay, all right. I'll handle the airplane. 28.
That was uncomfortable to watch and clearly dangerous had traffic really been 1,000 feet above David's assigned altitude. Let's look at some steps we can take to identify and fix potential avionics malfunctions in our different avionics platforms our members fly. In a G3000 equipped airplane, if we lose the AHRS, we might momentarily see a flash of an X, but the system will pretty quickly switch over to the operational attitude heading system. The autopilot's disconnect, so we want to cancel that message, and we'll need to switch our flight director to the operational side, and then we can re-engage our modes. However, the autopilot will not engage with just one functioning AHRS.
Autopilot.
If the system did not revert to the correct attitude heading, we can manually revert by pressing sensor, attitude heading settings, and then switching, in this case, to attitude heading 2. But again, the G3000 has done that for us already. If we have an ADC failure, we'll similarly momentarily see X's, but almost instantly the system is going to switch to the operational air data computer. Unlike with the AHRS failure, the autopilot will remain operative, and as long as we're displaying both on ADC 2, in this case with an ADC 1 failure, our checklist doesn't have any more steps for us. Again, we manually could go to sensors, ADC settings, and if it hadn't automatically switched to the operational ADC, we could manually force that switch over. Let's look at a situation similar to what David encountered. If we don't have a complete AHRS failure, but a partial loss, for example, maybe the attitude portion of the AHRS starts giving us bad data. Once the difference between the left and right sensed bank angle exceeds a set threshold, we'll see this roll enunciation on the attitude portion of our PFD. As soon as we see that roll, we know there's a disagreement between the left and the right's AHRS. We can use the standby instrument as a tiebreaker, and looking at the standby instrument, I see that the right AHRS source is likely to be the correct one. By going to sensors and switching my PFD to the good AHRS 2 and recoupling
Autopilot.
my autopilot now to the right side with the good data, we now have all of our indications matching. Of course, had this actually happened on an approach, we would have executed a missed approach rather than continuing. Let's look what happens if we have a PFD1 failure. Our checklist
CWS, system
is going to
failure.
direct us
Autopilot.
to select
Autopilot.
reversionary.
Autopilot.
Now, of course, at this moment, we've lost the autopilot, so we're going to resume hand flying. Once we've selected reversion on the pilot's display, the next step in our checklist is to transfer the flight director to the operational side and reselect our desired modes. We can re-engage the autopilot once we have our desired modes, should we be so inclined. Of course, if this actually happened at 1,200 feet on an approach, we would discontinue the approach, climb to a safe altitude, finish troubleshooting and running the procedure, rather than continuing.
Should we do the NXI?
Yes, and the final one is the G1000 NXI. Let's take a look at that one.
If you're flying more than one avionics platform, you know it can be really challenging, and sometimes that extra button push can be critically important. Let's take a look.
November 396 Delta Mike, maintain flight level 280. You have traffic crossing at 290.
6 Delta Mike, we're looking for the traffic in 280 on the altitude. Oh, great. All right, lost the screen. Well, okay, we're climbing to 28. Here we go, and go back here, look at the standby. We need to get that back. Autopilot. We've got the autopilot on, right?
396 Delta Mike, that traffic is now closing. Main level at flight level 280.
6 Delta Mike. Okay, we've gone through the
Autopilot.
altitude. Say again the altitude for 6 Delta Mike.
69 Delta Mike, begin immediate descent to flight level 280.
2806 Delta Mike, and we're looking for the traffic. Okay, all right. I'll handle the airplane. 28.
That was uncomfortable to watch and clearly dangerous had traffic really been 1,000 feet above David's assigned altitude. Let's look at some steps we can take to identify and fix potential avionics malfunctions in our different avionics platforms our members fly. Let's see what these failures look like on an NXI flight deck. First, let's see what an AHRS failure looks like. You'll notice we had a very quick black screen with some X's, but the NXI will automatically switch to the functioning AHRS if it has one left. Hence this message both on AHRS 2. If the system does not revert automatically, we can select PFD options, sensors, AHRS, and we can manually switch our AHRS. In this case, with AHRS 1 failed, we have no attitude or heading information, so we would just leave it on AHRS 2, which the system automatically switched to. It's important that we always comply with the emergency abnormal procedures, and for a failed attitude or heading, the checklist will direct us once we have both on AHRS 2 or 1 as appropriate selected. We want to couple our flight director to the functional side. So with AHRS 2 functioning, I need to press the transfer button, see my indicator point to the right side, and then reselect my desired flight director and autopilot modes. Let's look at how an air data computer or ADC failure would present. Similarly, we'll have a very short display of X's, but the system will very quickly revert to the functional ADC. So in this case, with a failure of ADC 1, our left PFD is going to automatically switch over to ADC 2. And just as we discussed with the AHRS, we can always go into our sensor option, ADC, and we could manually select the functioning ADC if the system didn't automatically revert. But of course, switching to ADC 1 is going to show us all of the information impacted by that failure. Loss of air data computer means we will lose our indicated airspeed, we're going to lose our altimeter, and we're going to lose our vertical speed. Finally, let's look at a failure of PFD1. Our checklist is going to direct us to press our display backup button. This will display our flight and ICAS information on the MFD. We hear our autopilot disconnect tone. We can cancel that with the autopilot disconnect button. We'll need to transfer our flight director to the operating PFD. We see that the arrow has moved to the right. Once that's done, we need to reselect our desired lateral and vertical modes since we ended up in roll and pitch. And then we'll need to switch our transponder as necessary to the functioning transponder if one failed. Finally, depending on how our failure presented, we may have lost corresponding nav and comm radios for number 1, so we would have to switch our frequencies to the number 2 radios.
Cool.
Excellent.
And let's look at the legacy airplane, see what that looks like.
You know, handling ADC and AHRS failures on legacy aircraft in particular can be really challenging. Are we ready for that? Let's take a look.
396 Delta Mike, continue right turn now, heading 310 degrees.
Right turn 3106 Delta Mike.
The speed vectors for the ILS runway 13 approach into San Antonio.
6 Delta Mike. Okay, we got the approach set up, and we'll be vectors for that. Okay, autopilot's disconnected, and we got a pitch or AHRS or something problem. We have no autopilot. All right, let's go back to the standby gyro, and we're ascending. Let's get back up to our altitude. 396 Delta Mike has an aircraft indication problem, and we'd like vectors to the airport, please.
396 Delta Mike, copy. Would you like to declare an emergency?
6 Delta Mike's declaring emergency.
6 Delta Mike, fly heading 310, maintain 4,000 feet, radar vectors ILS.
3106 Delta Mike, 4,000 feet. And let's standby. Standby's not working very well. 6 Delta Mike, standby. An AHRS failure, like what I had a few minutes ago, is one of the most serious, potentially serious situations in the airplane. It can cause confusion, actually fear, when the airplane is seemingly becoming uncontrollable. It's something that we practice a lot. We don't get much experience in it, but it's a really important part of our flying training. With me today to talk about those kind of failures is Indra Holan, our chairman of our CJP Legacy Committee. Welcome, Indra.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Glad to have you back in the Citation 2 sim. You actually had an experience similar to this in your airplane. Can you talk about it?
Yeah, I did. I was going into Opa-locka, and I was up at 43,000 feet off the coast of Florida. It was a dark night. Fortunately, some light on the left-hand side. I was on the west side of Florida. And I got a vector for traffic, and as soon as I hit the heading button, the AI on my pilot side tumbled, and autopilot kicks off, and I'm hand flying at 43,000 at night. And my peanut, or the standby gyro, is kind of down in the center area on that airplane. So I was flying from the co-pilot side, and let me tell you, it was a handful. The aircraft was light on the controls, up at the altitude, squirrely, and just the looking 45 degrees over to the co-pilot side, while also, doing radios and all kinds of stuff was quite disorienting. The other thing that I didn't realize was that it was very hard to keep the pilot side out of the scan.
Right, it's right in front of you.
Up here, so you kind of train to it. So a few lessons. One was I now keep one of those round stick-ons that you can stick on your artificial horizon if you ever had that problem.
To block your view.
To block the view. Because it was really messing with the perception, and you had to really focus on just looking over here and blocking it out. The second thing I've done is I've got one of those Dynon D3 pocket panel that I've installed right next to the pilot side, so that you have something that's right in front of you that shows you your attitude, which I would highly recommend. And the other thing that I would recommend is that if you have a GDL52 or a Stratus or a Sentry ADS-B in, they all have AHRS in them.
Right.
And I fly with an iPad right in front of me.
Okay.
And as soon as that would happen, I would hit to synthetic vision and get my attitude information there. Now you have a couple of different things right in front of you that can really help you out.
And you're probably very attuned to that situation because you actually had it happen to you.
I am, but let me tell you, even if you're attuned and you practice, it is not easy. So the more information you have in the cockpit, the better it is.
Yeah, that's great information.
Yeah.
Thanks for being with us.
Oh, yeah, you're welcome.
Look forward to seeing you again.
Okay.
Thanks.
That's a lot of attitude.
Yeah, totally. I didn't realize we were going to do that one, so you got the story twice. But the good news, just talking to all the legacy owners, is that the fleet is somewhere between halfway done to hopefully in the next couple of years fully upgraded into something that's a little more modern in terms of redundancy and glass and stuff. And everybody's eager to do it, and Garmin is working very hard on it, which I think will be a huge upgrade. But in the meanwhile, these little things like synthetic vision on your iPad or something that's very close to your scan is super useful.
Yeah, if you have a legacy airplane and you still have actual gyros in your airplane, that's something to look at converting. I mean, not a lot of pilots know how sensitive gyros are. They say in an avionics shop, if you put a gyro down loud enough on the counter that you heard it, you destroyed the gyro. They're that sensitive to tiny, tiny bits of imperfection.
And they do go out. I've had 2 or 3 go out over the years, in 6-7 years. They last a few thousand hours and then they're gone. So this will happen in the aircraft. And hopefully it doesn't happen at a bad time, but it will happen. So have a backup very close by is good, because that little thing run down there is impossible to fly from.
Yeah, very disconcerting.
Yep.
We have a few minutes for questions. If we have anybody want to ask a question?
Over there. Anyone have a mic?
Of this edge.
Anyone, Ryan? That's a great question. So the question, if you couldn't hear it, was if you've had something like a panel failure, when do you let ATC? I don't always make friends with controllers when I say this, but remember the phrase aviate, navigate, communicate. Yeah. And remember ATC's job, they have one job and one job only, and that's to keep 2 airplanes from hitting each other. That's their primary job. So always fly the airplane first, always deal with basic attitude control of the airplane first. When that's done, make sure you're going in the direction you want to go. That's the navigational piece. And then when you have time, and only when you have time, you can let ATC know. And depending on the situation, whether or not it rises to the level of notifying ATC. And some of these failures, an ADC failure, for example, you might feel like there's really no reason I needed to make any notifications.
To that question, we, in the companions training yesterday, what day is this, by the way? We talked about the concept of lead passenger. When you are in a true emergency situation, the first thing is probably going to happen, let's say smoke in the cockpit, in the cabin. First thing that's going to happen is you're going to hear screaming. That's coming to you from the passengers. And the baby, the grandbaby is crying, and the dog is whatever. And your attention is immediately going to be doing this to help, settle the situation when you should be focusing exactly on the problem at hand. If you have what is called a lead passenger, which is, the term is used in Fortune 500 flying, where you don't have a flight attendant, but you have a person on the plane. It could be a business associate, it could be your companion, who is trained to do things like help with oxygen mask. Where is the emergency exit? How to operate it? Where's the fire extinguisher? And that person is in charge of all the communication from the cockpit aft for every passenger. So that if a situation happens, it could be lots of things. It could be a passenger's ill, and the pilot is now in charge of flying the airplane, and that lead passenger is in charge of everything aft of there. And the passengers know that, so when they're aboard, even if it's your family, honey, today our lead passenger is, and the grandkids and the daughter, this is our lead passenger. So they know, in the event of a situation, that they are supposed to communicate with that lead passenger. And it may never happen. You may have let's say you have a laptop that's a lithium battery, it's on fire. This has happened many times in commercial aircraft. Who's going to handle that situation? So it's just something to think about that once in a million, but it could really reduce the stress and let you focus on flying the airplane.
And on that question about emergencies, super double secret bonus question. David made a mistake in the videos that we haven't commented on because it wasn't really germane to the point we were making. Does anyone know what it was?
I made a mistake?
Believe it or not.
Jeez.
Does anyone see specific when the ATC asked him what was going on and he said he was having some problems? Anybody know what David said? He said indication. Well, he may have. That's not what I'm getting at, though. So David said he was declaring an emergency. Does anyone know what the problem with saying I'm declaring an emergency is? It is actually a meaningless phrase. If you go in the AIM, the only time the AIM uses the phrase declaring an emergency is to tell pilots not to use the phrase declaring an emergency. So what is the proper way to let ATC know you have an emergency? Say the word Mayday 3 times. Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. And this may seem academic and not super important. There was actually a cargo flight in Japan, and the pilots kept saying, we're declaring an emergency. It's not standard ICAO phraseology. The controllers don't have to know what that means because it's not standard. And so the controllers had no idea what was happening. Anywhere outside the US, you will not hear that phrase. The proper phrase is Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. And then ATC knows exactly what's happening, and you've moved to the top of their priority list. So that's something that just in the last year or two, the FAA has started to...
They're finally starting to pick it up.
Starting to make a big deal out of it,
And
because
the other
pilots have been using this colloquial term that is completely meaningless in terms of official ATC procedures.
And the other one is pan, pan, pan.
And pan, pan, pan would be for an urgency situation, which will also get ATC's attention, but for a slightly lower level. Talk to flight safety?
Well, it's an evolving landscape. In the U.S., years and years and years ago, back when I started military training, there was things like we're declaring an emergency or we're declaring a precautionary, and we need to return to base. And so it wasn't quite, the difference from that standpoint was you don't alert all the fire trucks and everything. And so we've all heard the term, let's declare an emergency, but the correct term, like Neil is alluding to, has evolved, and Mayday, Mayday, Mayday is the correct one. If you're in direct communication with the controller and you want to be clear about what your problem is, you're going to say, I need priority, I need trucks on the ground to be ready for me when I land. Those kinds of assistance are what you're really after. So just be clear when you're in direct communication.
I think this is more of a comment than a question way in the back here.
Oh, there you go.
First of all, thank you very much. This is incredibly sobering, I think, for all of us, right? And I mean, you talked about emergency, aviate, navigate, communicate, and we all think about fly the plane. And I think everybody in this room, you're here, you're speaking to the choir, really thinks safety first. When I have friends who say, hey, what a great hobby that you fly, I say, it's not a hobby. It's a very serious thing, of course, but there is no doubt that you can task saturate anyone. And I've been in a Cirrus simulator, and they caught the plane on fire, and then they lost all the avionics, and, you got a chute to pull, as a final thing, but the chute caught on fire, and, so I mean,
on any given day.
It's always a little sobering and disturbing when they say pilot error in the end, failed to maintain directional control. But if your wing falls off and an engine shuts down and your avionics go out, at what point, we can all be task saturated, right?
Absolutely. And one of the previous series of videos, I think it's called When All Else Fails, if I remember right.
Yeah.
We talk about that very situation. We talk about, I think that might have actually been the one with the AHAR slow roll, maybe,
Yeah.
where David's presented with confusing information, the stress really starts piling up, and we really make that point. If your attitude, your pitch attitude of your airplane can be verified to be no less than a couple degrees down and no more than about 5 degrees up, your thrust is at an appropriate point and your wings are level. Unless you happen to be in the proximity of terrain right that moment, you're going to be fine for a minute or two, right? If your pitch attitude is in a, plus or minus right around 0, your wings are level, your thrust is around 60 to 70% N1, you're not going to probably come to any problem in the next minute or two. And sometimes, absolutely, it's backing to the very first, most fundamental step of that aviate, navigate, communicate. Put the attitude in a good position, put the thrust in a good position, take a breath or two. And that's that. I believe the title of it is When All Else Fails, where we try to make that point. When you start getting overloaded, just take it right back to the basics of attitude control.
Yeah, for your specific aircraft, you might go through a little exercise that you can then go advocate for yourself in the simulator to run through them. But just write down what are the typical problems that you can run into. You have AHRS and ADC, total failure, that's one thing. Then you have partial failures like the roll mode that we showed that was agreeing between the two sides. But you can make a list between attitude, heading, and ADC and miscompares, total failures, and just run through that list with your instructor to what's the proper response for your avionics in your airplane. And no matter what they are, the first move ought to be to control rates of motion. You don't want accelerations. You don't want climbs and descents, like Neil said. If you set pitch and power, now you've slowed everything down and you've got a minute to breathe and look around.
And I was with a very good pilot who's owned his 525 for years, and I was with him when he was flying in the sim, and he had an AHRS slow roll, and he either had never seen one before or he hadn't seen one for years. He actually lost control of the sim. They had to pause the sim, reset it back up. So think if that had been in an airplane for the first time. It was so disorienting. Andre made the comment about that compulsion of that bad instrument right in front of you.
Yep.
And when you see the attitude is showing a 45-degree bank to the left, but you're actually in a 60-degree bank to the right, guess what you want to do? You want to put in right aileron, and you're going to make the bank worse. And so he lost control of the sim. So just absolutely cannot emphasize enough. If you haven't done these in the sim, please put them on your next recurrent.
And the other one you and I had in the Mustang sim when we fly together is that ADC issue with a frozen pitot tube, and you're in a climb, and it's on one side miscomparing with the other, and you end up with both the stall horn and the overspeed horn, right? So the only way to keep from getting into that mode is to stop everything where you're at in the climb right there, slow everything down, that pitch and power for steadying where you're at, to not have it exacerbate itself into having both the stall horn and the overspeed horn at the same time. Good luck with that one, right? Remember that?
Yes, I do. And we are out of time. Now, I think we have the most extensive video safety library in the entire industry, and it's through the support, the financial support of all of you members for our Safety Foundation. So it's really remarkable, and it's very heartening to be a participant in this. And we also thank Flight Safety for making the simulators available every year and on our journeys to around the country. And we look forward to doing it again. So thank you guys very much. Thanks.